Please sit relaxed. Venerable ones, the physical body made up of the four elements is impermanent. From spleen and stomach, liver and gall, down to head, body hair, nails and teeth, one sees the empty forms of all these things. When you can bring your heart to rest, that is called the Bodhi Tree. When you cannot bring your heart to rest, that is called the tree of obscurity, or ignorance. Obscurity has no local abode. It has neither beginning nor end. If you cannot bring your heart to rest, you will climb up the tree of obscurity and enter the 6 ways and 4 modes of birth, and wear horns and... If you can put your heart to rest, this is the realm of pure body. If not one thought arises, you will at once climb up the Bodhi tree, have the supernatural powers to transform yourselves at will in the 3 worlds, have the Dharma and the bliss of Zen. The radiance of the essence shines of itself. When you think of robes, 1,000 kinds of gauze and brocade. When you think of food, a supply of 100 flavors, and you will live to a ripe old age. Bodhi, or awakening, has no local abode, and so there is nobody who can obtain it. So here we have another one of the sermons from Master Rinzai, who is, of course, the founder of this particular line of Zen. Rinzai is his Japanese name, Lin-Chi was his Chinese name, and he lived around about the 9th century in China. We've talked about him before. Didn't live to a ripe old age, died in his middle 50s. We don't know exactly when he was born, but we do know he had a very short teaching career, only about 10 years, which is actually very short when compared to many of the other great figures in the lineage. And yet, despite the fact that he had such a very short period of time for teaching, the impetus that he set in motion still continues even down to the present day, because there are only 2 existing houses with a complete lineage in Japan today. Soto, which is the larger, and the other is Rinzai, which is ours, and so it is still going even after 1,000 years. And remarkable too, because we hear him speak, and although he refers to a number of Buddhist doctrines here, which we will go through, actually there is something tremendously succinct and direct and very powerful in his delivery. And Rinzai says elsewhere in this collection, the Rinzai Roku as it's known, he says, actually everything I teach is medicine for curing specific illnesses. And this really is the power of the teaching, and particularly for those who have gone through it. And this is very different from book learning now. That one who has gone through it develops what's called the single eye. This is what's known in Zen as the single eye, or the Dharma eye, and is able to see clearly. And so that when someone comes before them, the problem is seen. And then the medicine is actually applied, whatever that medicine might be. And this is why we need to be careful when we read, particularly some of the Zen treatises, because often they can be alarmingly contradictory. Master Rinzai was brilliant at that. He could even turn the 5 heinous crimes, as they're known in Buddhism, into what he called the ocean of deliverance. The 5 heinous crimes are to kill the father, harm the mother, to spill the blood of a Buddha, to destroy scriptures and icons, and to cause disharmony amongst the Sangha, amongst the Buddhist community. And one would think these truly are 5 heinous crimes, and indeed they are, marked on even in the early Buddhism. And yet he talks about them, he takes them and turns them completely around, and he was always doing this. We have to remember that he was speaking to his monks. He obviously lived in a male monastery and was teaching them. And so these were people who had been immersed in Buddhism, many of them since they were children. And they're just like Rinzai himself had been there since he was a boy as well. So for them, the whole of Buddhism was the whole of their lives too. There was nothing outside of that. Perhaps a little bit unlike some of us as lay people, we learn about the practice, we take it on board and we call ourselves Buddhists perhaps, and it's somehow we feel that there's my life over here and then there's Buddhist practice sort of over here. And often when speaking to people, one of the questions that usually gets asked is, and how's the practice going? And people say, oh, I haven't had time for practice. Well, if we've been living our lives, then we have time for practice. We always have time for practice. But often what people mean by that is the formal practice, such as sitting meditation or some chanting or something like that, which is certainly part of it. There's and an important part too. But actually the practice has to be developed and cultivated over quite a long period of time and has to become our lives. And actually interesting, just as a very slight aside, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I saw on breakfast TV there was an item on mindfulness, which I'm sure, as probably most of you will know, has become quite popular now. There's been a lot written about it, particularly about its quote stress-busting unquote quiz, and meditation too. And that's absolutely fine. There's no problem. But it is interesting because, like a lot of these things, they're sort of picked up and cherry-picked a little bit, and there's a lot of picking and choosing going on. People say, oh, that's interesting, and do it for a time, like the latest sort of thing or the latest sort of fad, and then one thinks that, oh, that'll probably get put down till the next thing comes along. But actually, the practice of well, what's called mindfulness, we call it daily life practice. The real practice of daily life practice has to be developed and cultivated over a long period of time and requires considerable commitment if it's really to bed itself down, if it's really to be part of our lives. And this is why our practice, quite simply, is to just give myself wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done anyway. And if we find that we've ceased to be wholehearted, or that we're shying away, or that I'm picking and choosing about this and that, and I'm lost in those thoughts about whether I want to do this, or I think, oh, actually this is boring and I don't want to be here, just to really jump back into the situation and once again wholeheartedly give myself back into what at this moment is being done. And that's it, really. In essence, that is our practice. All the rest, as one old rabbi once said, all the rest is commentary, really, on that. That is really what it is. And this is why we're here as well, because we renew our commitment. We remind ourselves what we're about. And there's that sort of, hopefully, taking a little bit of the spirit and once again putting that back into that daily life practice. So we have that continual cultivation. And in fact, there's a Sanskrit term for it that we use in Buddhism called bhavana, which means continual cultivation. Bhavana, interestingly also, is another term that is used to mean meditation. Bhavana actually does mean meditation, because meditation is, in fact, it's a continual cultivation, a continual becoming, walking a Buddha's path, becoming, getting closer and closer to that realization, the realization that the Buddha himself had underneath the Bodhi tree. And we have the Bodhi tree as it appears here. Bodhi simply means awakening, or to wake up. We know the term also from bodhisattva. Sattva means a being, so bodhisattva means a being who is awake, and the Bodhi tree is the tree of awakening. And traditionally, if you remember the Buddha's story, after the 5 ascetics had left him, he sat himself down under the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening, and it was underneath that tree that he awoke to the realization of Buddhahood. And so hence that tree became known as the immovable spot, and also as the tree of awakening as well. And that tree of awakening, I mean, actually you can go to Bodh Gaya and you can actually see a tree there, and it's called the Bodhi tree. And according to tradition, it's not the actual tree. No tree lives, well, some trees do live can live 2,000 to 3,000 years, but it's supposed to have been a seedling anyway. Anyway, it's supposed to be related to the original tree that he sat under. Who knows? But actually, the tree of awakening has a much wider meaning than that. Actually, the tree of awakening is wherever awakening takes place, wherever insight actually arises. That is the Bodhi tree. So the tree of awakening itself actually stands for awakening, for realization, for enlightenment as well, or for that clarity of seeing, which of course points back to that Buddha nature too. Venerable ones. So we start with our sermon. Venerable ones. And of course, he's talking to his monks, so generally the Sangha are referred to as venerable. But that also refers to us too, venerable ones. Do we think, therefore, that somebody's venerable because they wear a robe? Actually, it's a fascinating thing about wearing robes and about wearing clothes as well, because actually the robe means something, but uniforms also mean something as well. If you go into a hospital and you see a doctor wearing a coat and with a stethoscope, we don't know the person underneath that. The person underneath that has all sorts of trials and tribulations going on in their own lives. But what we rely on actually with that doctor is their expertise. And if that was there, then it would be very difficult to hand ourselves over to that person's care. And that when that person gives us advice and says you need to take these pills 3 times a day, then we would not feel, we would think, well, why should I take your advice? It would be rather like asking somebody on the corner, on the street corner, what should I do with this headache or this pain or whatever? But we don't, because that person wears that particular uniform. And so actually when we listen to that person, we're not listening to that person personally, we're listening to that person in the role that they are actually partaking in. And it's exactly the same also with the robe as well. One who wears the robe, actually, so you see it, I remember being quite alarmed, because the idea of bowing to people now, or even abasing ourselves in front of others, is something that we would regard as rather shocking nowadays, because we see ourselves as equal, which is fair enough, we all have equal rights, certainly. But yet, actually, if we go to somebody for example, then there is an immediate inequality. Otherwise, we wouldn't be going to that person. We revere that person. We look up to that person, not necessarily personally, but we look up to their expertise or to what they actually represent to us. I mean, even if we, for example, went to learn a sport or something like that, we go to a teacher, say we go to learn to swim, for example. We are looking up to the instructor's expertise. And there would be no point going there and say, well, I would like to learn to swim. And the instructor says, okay, well, first of all, you have to get into the water. And then I say, I'm not getting in the water. I came to learn to swim, but I don't want to get in the water. We wouldn't, that would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? We have to take the advice of the person. Otherwise, there's no point going to them. We're wasting their time and my own as well. And so, actually, this robe is there. And I remember going to certainly a Vardan tradition, and certainly, for example, I know when I went to Chiswick Vihara, for example, in West London, they're Sri Lankan monks there, and they have a large Sri Lankan community around in that area, and coming in, it's quite normal. You see the men and the women come in and they get down on their knees before the monk and they touch their head to the floor like this. And the monk sort of stands there quite patiently. And sometimes I've even been times when I've been talking to the monk and somebody comes rushing in between us, and you have to stop and stand back, and the monk just stands there sort of quietly, and the person kneels down, touch their forehead to the floor. And it's just the tradition. That's the tradition that they've been done. Think absolutely nothing of it. But I remember being really shocked myself when I first saw that and thinking, oh my goodness, in that way. But there we are. Actually, that ability to be able to look up to something. What are we looking up to? The person? No, actually, what we're looking up to is what that person represents. And when we come in and bow to the Buddha, it's just a wood. It's a lump of gilded wood. Nice statue, nicely crafted perhaps, but it's still a lump of wood. That's not what we're bowing to. What we're bound to is actually what it represents. And that something always has to be higher than ourselves. And in this case, it represents the Dharma, the teachings. Interestingly, in the Pali Canon, the Buddha said that even he too had something to look up to. What he looks up to is the Dharma. What he said is people look up to me, and said that is quite right, they should. But what I look up to the Dharma, and he said everybody should always have something to look up to. Why is that? Well, if there's nothing above me, then actually I am supreme. There's actually nothing to contain me either. And that's a little bit too godlike. And human beings who think themselves a little bit too godlike are a little bit flirting with danger, or a lot flirting with danger. So that venerable ones, he calls them venerable ones, though he is the teacher there. 2. The physical body is made up of the 4 elements and is impermanent. And we have those 4 elements too, at least in our history. They were traditionally fire, water, air and earth, and used in medicine, and they were used, in fact that's where they originated, and they were used in alchemy too, and they were used in theology too. And this is how things were understood. We look at things a little bit differently now. But actually, before, it's easy to dismiss them and think, oh, well, that's just, that was wrong and it was old superstition, etc. But actually, they didn't see these elements in quite the same way as we do. When we look at the elements, we think of the periodic table, for example, and we think of elements like hydrogen or gold or sodium or strontium or something like that. They are atomic elements. But actually, the elements of fire, air, and earth are in fact qualities of things. They're not a substance as such. They're qualities of things. And so it was believed that everything, or it was considered, not believed, it was considered and analysed that all things, whether physical things or even mental things, example, had qualities of fieriness or liquidity or wateriness or airiness or solidity and earthiness. So that these are qualities that something is made up of. So, for example, a metal such as gold would be considered it has quite an earthy quality to it, more of an earthy quality than, say, the metal mercury, which is liquid. Mercury would be considered to have a higher content of water in it than something like wood, for example. But if you set fire to wood and you see smoke coming off and you would see water coming off, and then you would have ash remaining. So the ash would be considered earthy. Water vapor that comes off is watery, obviously, as well. Well, these are solid objects, or these are physical objects, but actually, even in the realm of our psychic or inner world, it was also considered that everything was made up of these qualities too. So, for example, our sensation, our awareness of colour and form, or of sound, or tactile sensations, or smells and tastes, for example, our 5 physical senses, they were considered very earthy because they connected with physical things. Whereas, for example, our imagination was considered very watery because imagination very mutable. It transforms itself, and rather like water in a cup or in a bowl or in a vase, it takes the form of whatever it's poured into, just as imagination can also take the form of whatever we imagine. It's that plasticity that is the watery content of it. Our reason was considered very airy. And this is because our reason and logic is based very much on a sort of yes or no type of mode. And the wind can blow one way and it can blow the other as well. And so this was seen as an airy quality, for example. And our intuition, that was seen as fiery, because things that are fiery have light. And they're also very immediate. If you think of a spark or lightning or something like that, and intuitions can come to us in a blinding flash. We say we were illuminated. Suddenly I saw what was going on in that way, and you need light to see. And so that's a fiery quality. And so these 4 qualities, again, they're not substances, they're qualities of things. And everything was seen to be made up of it. And even if you go into the natural world, for example, obviously birds were considered airy, fish more watery, and so on, and certain trees and rocks and things like that, and even parts of plant animals were made up of these four elements. So the flowers, for example, are fiery, the leaves are airy, the sap is watery, and the roots are earthy of a plant or a tree, in this sort of way. So everything was considered just made up of these four elements. And the thing about these four elements is that although we see objects like trees and people and plants and we have thoughts or imaginations, actually they're solid. They're not just things in themselves. They are made up of something smaller. They're made up of these elements, in other words. And so these elements are constantly coming together to create a form that exists for a while, then they fall apart. And then they produce another form, and so on. Now, I remember, actually, just staying with that theme, I remember seeing a fascinating article a few years ago called The 65 Million Year Old Sunbeam. And it said, just imagine 65 million years ago. There we have, swimming in the sea, all these sort of single-celled creatures like plankton and so forth, and many of them are also have chlorophyll too, and they can take in energy from the sun. And so this sunbeam, this sun was shining 65 million years ago, and these creatures were absorbing the energy of the sun, and they were turning it into sugars and carbohydrates, which is what plants do anyway. And then those organisms die, and they were living in the ocean, and they fell down to the seabed, and over many millions of years the sediment got thicker and thicker and thicker, and then it fossilizes, and then it petrifies and turns into rock, and then you get these certain earth shapes of the strata, and there, under that tremendous pressure and under that tremendous heat, the actual chemical compounds actually get transformed, and later on human beings come along and they drill down, and out comes crude oil, and that crude oil into a plant where it's fractionated and turned into various things, and one of the things that's produced is petrol. And petrol can be put into a car. And the petrol that's put into a car obviously runs the motor. But the motor that runs also charges up the car battery as well. And so we imagine now a car driving. It's just the sun's going down. It's just coming into dusk. And driving through a countryside, something like that. And suddenly realizes it's time for a bit too dark, time to switch the headlights on. Switch the headlights, and suddenly now, after 65 million years, that energy is once again transformed into and shines out into the darkness, and the photons fly out into space where they originally came. There's a wonderful sense of that sort of physical transformation. But my goodness, how about if we apply it to ourselves? Here we are in this room, for example. There's wooden floorboards underneath, which are organic. There is also plaster on the walls as well, and that will have lime in it too. And who knows how many human lives we are walking on, or we are surrounded by. Who knows how many times we too have been floorboards, or plaster in a wall, or falling out of the rear of a cow. I don't. We have all been there. We have all been there. And certainly in Buddhism, that sense, because often when we look at that sense of, say, of rebirth, in Buddhism there's this talk of beginningless beginning, and how the rebirths have gone on and on and on and back into sort of endless time. And that therefore, all the transformations that are possible, all the different organisms, we have been them all at one point or another. This has that sense. Don't necessarily have to go literally with that, but that sense of constant transformation. And because of this sense of constant transformation, actually it becomes very difficult to grasp onto just an individual life. The single individual life now suddenly becomes not so important. My life, suddenly this thing, my concern right now, how I must have things, because we know how it is. When a passion really grips me, and suddenly it becomes absolutely must. I cannot live without. But if there is that recall of those endless incarnations and those transformations going into the past and also going into the future as well, for however long, forever we might say, then actually there is that sense just now, I do not have to be quite so frightened of not getting what I want. And perhaps it is possible to endure. I remember Venerable Myokyoni used to say that the Buddha nature itself, which is, if you like, it's the Buddha nature, it's not really quite right to call it a thing, but is that which undergoes all these transformations through endless time, has really seen it all. Really seen it all. You know, oh, here comes another death. Oh, yes, been here. Oh, and another rebirth, yes. Oh, and this problem, oh, yes, yes. Because it's really, whereas for me, on top, the first time, petrified, absolutely overwhelming. But for the Buddha nature, actually seen it so many times. So those four elements, this is the physical body in this case, Master Rinzai is referring to. The physical body is made up of those four elements and is impermanent. And this is why also, actually in all religions, all the religions actually have a great focus on mortality and death. And clearly all of them have seen at some point just how important that event is, the meaning of death is for those of us who are alive, even whilst we're living our own lives. Because this is really one of the particularly eventful, perhaps to say, events for us as human beings. We are very aware of our own death, apparently more so than other living creatures, though other living creatures are aware of death too. But we worry about it more. And that is the fascinating thing. I mean, personally myself, having hit 50, I remember there was that moment when you suddenly think, oh my goodness, I really am not a young man anymore. And that thought comes in and, oh my goodness, you know, suddenly having to see oneself differently. And it is fascinating because it's almost as if this being here, this whole being, is sort of getting on with the living, getting on with the transformations, getting on with the aging process, and every so often little I catch up with it or have this sudden realization thinking, oh my God, is this really happening? And it's fascinating because I really think I know myself. I like to think that I know myself, you know, particularly having been a practicing Buddhist for so many years and all this sort of thing. But, you know, life continuously takes us by surprise. If it didn't, then there would be no insight, of course. But it continuously takes us by surprise, and every so often we catch up with it. And sometimes we get very frightened of it too, because I don't like the transformations, actually. Scary. I don't want to go that way. And so this is where I now resist life. And this is what's called dukkha, suffering or dissatisfactoriness, because I cannot accept life as it is. And I don't want to accept life as it is. And of course, this is why the Buddha formulated those Four Noble Truths and said that the cause of suffering was precisely this, getting attached to some idea of either who I am or what I want. Nothing wrong with these wants that arise, or even these not liking, but to become attached to them and to live in fear of not getting them. That's where the suffering comes in, and that's where the real mess making happens also. And this is how the Buddha diagnosed our particular sickness. Actually, I remember when I being on holiday once I went to the Sinai desert and did a trip to a place called St. Catherine's Monastery, which is just on the Sinai Peninsula. And it's the oldest continuously lived in monastic establishment. It was founded in the 4th century AD by the wife of the Emperor Justinian. And a magnificent place. Originally, it was completely walled. Because there were lots of bandits in the countryside or in the desert surrounding it. There was no gateway, there was no doorway in. The only way was they would lower a basket and you would get into it and they would winch it up. And that was the only way in and out of the monastery. Well, they've solved the bandit problem now, so they've actually opened a gateway, so you can go in and out. But the walls are still there and they've still got the winching mechanism as well. And it's actually built right at the foot of Mount Sinai, where, according to the Old Testament Moses, Moses received the Ten Commandments. And so you've got this imposing man just right by it. Obviously the monastery itself is built on granite, so there's no ground that you can dig into. And so they had a problem. What were they going to do with the monks when they died? And so what they did, they excavated graves into the granite, and if a monk dies, then they put him into the ground, they cover it over, and leave him for 2 years. And then they dig him out, and by that time the flesh is gone, and there's just the bones, and they separate the bones out, and they put them in the charnel house. And the charnel house lies just outside of the monastery on the main road leading up to the monastery. And Catherine's monastery is a place of pilgrimage. And so, people would come, and they were expected, before they actually came into the monastery, they were expected to go down to the charnel house. And so we all went down, and you go down these steps, and there's this sort of wooden door, and there's a little grill in the door, and you press your face up against it like this, which we all did, and inside there's this large room full of the monks, dating back to the 4th century AD. It's quite incredible, really. 1600 years. And you've got, it's this sort of typical, how everything's very neat. You've got the legs, down the sides here, the long bones. So they start at the 4th century and go 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, right the way up to the 20th, 21st century. And then at the back, you've got all the skulls. So those start on the floor at 4th century, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, work right the way up to the 20th, 21st. So you can imagine there's a lot of them. And in the middle of the room, there is a large wooden chair. And very big and very ornate. It's the Archbishop's chair, because St. Catherine's Monastery has its own Archbishop. And this is Orthodox Christianity, because there the Archbishop sits in all his finery, and if you've ever been into an Orthodox church, you'll know just how profuse the gold and gems are there. They really like to sort of, splash out. And there one of the archbishops sits with his hat on and his robe, and really is covered in brocade and in jewels sewn in and gold thread, absolutely magnificent. And there he sits, this grinning skeleton, in all this finery. And as if to say, yes, you see, even the Archbishop of St. Catherine's Monastery does not escape this. And of course, the whole thing is there to designed to make you think, well, whatever you think your problems are, don't forget where they end. Whatever you think your successes are, don't forget where it'll all end up. And my goodness, I have to tell you, it really does work. It really does work. And interestingly, if you go to a Buddhist establishment, or a Buddhist temple or monastery, somewhere near the doorway you will see one of these. This is the Wheel of Life. And this is our equivalent, if you like, of that charnel house, because there you see all the incarnations, and in particular you see that rather frightening looking being with 3 eyes who grabs hold of the wheel like that with his teeth and fangs, and he's got his 5 skulls in his headdress, which represent the impermanent 5 skandhas. And although he isn't on this one, in some of them you see he's biting into the wheel. He's actually devouring the wheel, just as time devours things. And of course, he looks terrifying, because from our point of view, he's taking away that one I simply can't live without. The one thing I don't want to lose. He's biting into it like this. So he looks terrifying. But actually, all he is impermanence. He's just the principle of continuous change. So he's quite neutral in himself. But what makes him look so terrifying is that from my point of view, I don't want to lose myself. I don't want to lose this, whatever it is. Of course, sometimes, if it's something I don't like, then I can't wait for him to come along, in which case he's a benign angel. It just depends what my own particular point of view is on that. So that impermanence is tremendously important. And remarkably, this isn't something that's sort of put on. It seems to be inborn in us. There is an awareness in us of that impermanence, and of particularly our own impermanence. as well. And I think more than ever, because these days people are very frightened of certainly growing old, and certainly, for example, losing our faculties and dying, which is all aspects of the transformation and aging and dying process anyway. We become very frightened of that, and yet there's something in us that is very aware that this is the way it goes and lives with that knowledge. And I mean, I've told this anecdote before. It's useful because it shows how there really are those different levels of consciousness. On the top level, there's my consciousness with all my likes and my dislikes and my picking and choosing, and this is how things suit me and all the rest of it, and this is how I want to be, and so on. But underneath, there is a much more impersonal layer of consciousness that responds, and perhaps think is not quite the word, but sees things very differently to me. And we don't recognize that always. And that all this makes up what we call the heart. And normally when I look inside myself, what do I see? I see my thoughts and my likes and my dislikes and my hopes and my fears. It's all to do with me. And we think that's all that there is in the heart. We think that's the heart. But actually the heart is tremendously deep and tremendously profound. And all the spiritual paths is really about coming into contact and, as it were, becoming aware of and listening to the heart and taking in the information and living in accord with that information, because that deep level of consciousness, that's the one that's been here, done it, worn the T-shirt since beginningless time. And I remember, this was a good few years ago, back in the 90s, I've had one of these, I've joined up into one of these gyms, of which there are many of them now, these chains. And there was one nearby where I worked. I thought this would be a good thing. And I've never been particularly keen on exercise, never been particularly sporty, and I've always carried too much bandage as well, and really thought, well, got to do something about this. So I joined up and started going, and you know how it is. It's all a bit sort of tentative at first, so I thought, well, I'm not going to splash out on lots of expensive gear, so I sort of looked through the old drawers and managed to find an old pair of shorts and a sort of faded T-shirt and an old pair of sort of plimps with bits of paint splattered over them and all this sort of thing, and an old pair of white socks and whatever. I thought, well, that'll do. And so I went along to this place. Well, it was a nice gym, I have to say. But I walked in, and up to that time, I'd never been to one of these places before. It's quite new, the whole concept. I've been to leisure centres, but leisure centres are, you play badminton, or there's a swimming pool, or, you go to a class for whatever. But actually in these gyms, it's much more individual. So people come in, there's machines. You get on the machine, you plug yourself in, you watch TV, you listen to the music, you run, or you do your cross-train or whatever, you leave. It's all slotted into your sort of life, as it were, in that way. All very luxurious and all very nice. But I remember turning up to this place, and there it was, these panels of TV screens, and people plugged in the mirrors all the way around so you could watch yourself, you see. And I remember clambering onto sort of this machine and started sort of going and looking around, and it's difficult not to begin to compare oneself with others in those sort of situations, and to think, God, it's a long way to go, isn't it? And you sort of this thought arises, and conceive this thought to think, maybe if I work really hard, maybe, for once, I've always been fat, and, in fact, you always go through life feeling somehow slightly inferior with the way I look, and it's just, there's a self-consciousness that never really leaves. And so that gives rise to this desire to want to achieve this ideal. I have this big idea in my head of how I could look, and I play with it, in my mind, and it becomes a wonderful thing. This is the thing about a thought, particularly when it gets charged up in this way by a good hot passion. It becomes so alluring. It really becomes the golden ball that I cannot resist. And so, it's barely conscious, really, that it's there. And I think, well, maybe one day I too wear lycra and not feel ashamed. And there I am in my old plimsolls and so forth. And so this was sort of going on. And then I remember this, as I say, this was sort of mid-90s. It was around about this time that the reports, or the West was becoming interested in what was going on with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And I remember reading this report of the very sort of eye for type of justice that was there. It was a reporter was there, I don't know whereabouts, but somewhere. A man had been found guilty of murder. He was immediately dragged outside. He was held down, and the mother of the murder victim was given a butcher's knife. He cut off his head. And it was really described, and it was really horrible. But the fascinating thing about this is that actually we see horrible things all the time. We read about horrible things all the time. We go, ugh, and then we forget about them. They don't, it's gone, we're on to the next thing. But for some reason, this really stuck. It really stuck. And I couldn't get this image out of my head. You know that feeling when your stomach really, you go, something feels so repellent and ghastly that it just can't shake that feeling off. And of course, you know what it's like when something gets you like that. You do forget it for a while, but then you sit down and you have a moment, and suddenly the whole thing comes back into consciousness again. You think, oh my God, I thought I'd forgotten that, and the whole thing. And interestingly, along with that, this image came up of a butcher in his butcher's shop with a big marble slab, and he had a big, thick steak on that slab, and he had this butcher's knife, and he was cutting it, and it was going, and it was just bleeding over the place, and it was a revolting image, really horrible. Sorry if this is putting you off, but anyway, so I think I've got the point across. Anyway, so this kept coming up, and just kept coming up, and I knew this had become fixed. I knew enough about psychology to know that this had really become something, and couldn't understand it at all, why this particular thing had really got me. And this is the fascinating thing when those things come in like this, that make us stop. It's almost as if it's something in our heart is saying, now just look, stop just going around with your head in the clouds, look at this. And I didn't want to. And I remember it got to the point, this went on for a few weeks, and it got to the point when I was on a bus coming down the Finchley Road, and the bus got caught in a traffic jam. And at that moment, this whole imagery, all this imagery came up again with the beefsteak by the butcher. And I remember thinking, oh God, not again. And I do not know what happened. I'd love to say that I gave myself into the fire and all this sort of thing. I honestly really don't know quite what happened. But at that moment, something blew. Something just completely opened up. And with that image, up came this voice that said, so there you are. After all, you're nothing but a bloody meat. Like that, and I suddenly, that whole idea of achieving this physical ideal and this perfection and wearing and looking wonderful in the mirrors and all, the whole thing just collapsed all in one big heap. And I suddenly ran, of course, this is my own heart telling me you really are being a bloody fool, going off on these big ideas. This is who you are. We're all going the same way, so don't get overly attached to these silly images that you are conjuring and making out of the vapours. It's fascinating, really, because who is that voice? Whose was that voice that said you are nothing but a lump of bloody flesh? It wasn't me. It certainly wasn't me. I was the one who had the ideals and wanted to be like this. But there was that other, much deeper voice. And from time to time, we all experience that in our lives. My mother had been on a diet since 1967, and we all joined in with her. So she definitely wasn't that voice. She had her own body image problems.
She saw a woman chopping off.
No, it was the bloodiness of it. It was the dismemberment, the fact that this body could just be taken apart into pieces, rather than my mother. I promise. So there we are. We have that image. We have that. This is who I want to be. And then there is that other one there who lives and sees things, actually, in a much more realistic way. The physical body is made up of the 4 elements and is impermanent. From spleen and stomach, liver and gall, down to head, body hair, nails and teeth, one sees the empty forms of all these things. And those empty forms, what does it mean to see those empty forms? It's actually just to see their nature, the nature of the fact that they transform. Because what I'm saying is what that voice was, actually is that voice of emptiness that recognizes the emptiness of all things. When you can bring your heart to rest, that is called the Bodhi Tree. When you can bring your heart to rest. Even before Rinzai, the Bodhi Dharma, who was known as the 28th Indian patriarch and the first Chinese patriarch and thus the first patriarch of Zen, when he came over India, he was escaping persecution. He came to China. China was already a Buddhist country, at least provisionally anyway, and the emperor himself was also Buddhist. And there was an encounter between Bodhidharma and the Emperor Wu, which you can read about in the books. But after that encounter, he crossed the Yangtze River and went to live in a cave. And there it said that he sat there facing the wall for 9 years. And during that time, or towards the end of that time, a young monk came to see him called Eka, who would later actually become the second patriarch, second Chinese patriarch. And he came along, obviously done quite a lot of training already. He knew a thing or two and was considerably deep in his own practices. But despite all that, he still found that he was troubled. And so he came to find Bodhidharma to see if he could help him. And the story goes that Eka came and called to Bodhidharma, asking for him to teach him the Dharma. And Bodhidharma just ignored him, carried on facing the wall. And so Eka, realizing that this was a test to see how sincere he was, remained standing outside the cave. And overnight, the snow fell, and it was said that by the morning he was standing in snow up to his. And Bodhidharma took pity on him and said, "What is it that you've come for?" And Eka replied, he said, "I've come for the Dharma." And Bodhidharma reviled him, saying, "You weak, pathetic nature." He said, "You, with your half efforts and your half good intentions, come here. Do you not know that the old ones ground their marrows into dust to realize the Dharma? Who are you to come here asking for the Dharma?" And so it's said that Eka took his sword, cut off his arm at the right elbow, and presented it to Bodhidharma as a sign of his sincerity. And of course we think of things like that and we think, oh my God, what have I got myself into now? But actually, again, we should not take these things literally, please. I remember Venerable Myokyoni saying, somewhat wryly, she says, "Well, you might squirm at that," she said, "but just to ask ourselves, just be honest," said, "what would we be willing to give up for the Dharma, for that realization?" She said, because actually, if we follow this practice, sooner or later, we're going to be asked to give up things. There are things that we will be asked to lay down. There may not be physical parts of our body, but even simple things like time, for example. How much time would I be prepared to give up? And actually it makes us realize that if we embark on any activity, I mean, say we wanted to learn to play the piano, for example. A lot of children learn to play the piano. But if you do learn to play it, if you want to play it properly, you have to practice regularly. Perhaps you have to do an hour or 45 minutes a day if you just want to play reasonably well. And that's a small sacrifice, because you might otherwise be with your friends or watching TV or whatever, doing something else. But in other words, a sacrifice does have to be made if we really want to do this. And that discipline is formative on us, because it enables us to do something very important, which is actually to embark upon a particular path and to be consistent in our application. Because it's always been true that for anything that's been worth doing, we have to make an effort, and we have to continue to make an effort. And this practice is no different either, as we've already mentioned at the beginning. And so that arm being handed over actually meant a lot. And perhaps also what we don't always appreciate here in the West is that the belief was, particularly in China at that time, there was a belief that unless you were physically perfect, you could not get into heaven. And so actually what Eka was doing was not just cutting off his arm, he was cutting off his right to enter heaven when he died. That's actually what he was handing over to Bodhi. So it was much bigger than just handing over an arm. And Bodhidharma replied, saying, okay, he said, what is it that you really want then? And Eka said, my heart is not at peace. Please pacify my heart. So here we have exactly that same situation. When you cannot bring your heart to, that is called a tree of obscurity or of ignorance. And this question of Eka's, my heart is not at peace, please pacify my heart, actually shows just how far Eka had already gone along the path. Because for most of us, if we felt that there was something wrong with our lives, it wouldn't be what I want. That's not what's wrong with my life. What's wrong with my life is my boss doesn't appreciate my work, my partner doesn't take me seriously, I was dropped on my head as a baby, I don't know. My friends, they're not always there for me. There's this, there's that, there's the other. There's this list as long as your arm about things that are not wrong. In other words, it's always in things or situations, or even in myself as well. I'm too short, I'm too fat, I'm too this. If only I was like this or that. We do not see, and this is what the Buddha is actually asking us to really look at, we do not see that it's our heart itself which creates these problems by the demands that it makes through these attachments. And that this is what needs to be let go. And that when we let go of these things, actually we discover a much deeper level of nature within ourselves. And we think, of course, now, well, that's all very well to say, but if I really let go of all these things, I'd never get out of the armchair. I'd never bother getting out of bed in the morning. And we honestly think that that's true, because we think that for anything in my life to happen, I must be doing it. I must make it happen. And therefore I must have my ambitions, and I must live out my ambitions. Otherwise my life will become naught, will come to naught. But really, just look, here we are in this universe, 13.8 billion years old, so we're told. It's never had an ambition in its life. It's not done badly. And yet here I am saying, but my life stretches before, what is my life about? What am I make of myself? And all this. I remember there's a quote from, I think it was the philosopher Schopenhauer, who said when he was in his late 60s, he says, I look back on my life, he says, and I see that there seems to be this sort of thread running through it. He said, there were certain times in my life when what I thought was quite an inconsequential decision was made, but as a result of that, it produced the most profound changes in direction in my life that I could never have guessed. And yet I look at my life and it seems to be as if somehow there was this script being lived out of. But the question for me is, who that script? Because he recognized that he did not. That actually there is a very deep layer within us that, well, this is what's called the Buddha nature. It's the nature of things. And this idea of the nature of things is tremendously important in Buddhism, and very important actually in the East generally, in the way that people think in the East. In the In the East, Buddhism is included in this. The purpose of religion is to recognize, first of all, that human beings, for some reason, have fallen out of harmony with nature. And that the role of religion is to get us back into harmony with. That's all it needs to do. Nature looks after the rest. So this whole idea of I doing, I making something of myself, actually is the tail wagging the dog, so to speak. Life is enormous. I am like that. And life produces us, not the other way around. And this, perhaps particularly for us in the West, is one of the most difficult ideas, even, to come to terms with in Buddhism. We like a lot of things about Buddhism. We might like the meditation, we might like the fact that it looks very peaceful and so on. We might like the idea of nature, etc. But the idea of actually handing myself over to nature rather than controlling it, even my own nature, making myself thinner, making myself like this, not liking the fact that I have a temper. But surely it's not a good thing to have a temper. Well, if you've got a temper, you've got a temper. There we are. I'm not saying that you should let it out all over the place, but however, if that's part of the makeup, then that's part of the makeup. There we go. You know? So, I don't trust it. I don't want to trust it. And so actually, where the lack of faith comes in, and why faith is always tremendously important in religion. Our practice, and any spiritual practice, is always about cultivating that faith. Cultivating that faith. Cultivating that faith, because without that faith, I cannot hand myself over into something. And it's the same also when we're working with the bull, when we're working with those passions, and that tremendous energy that comes out. And we try and practice a little bit of discipline, and we discover that there's that tremendous force there, that something in me that says, no, I don't want to get up at this time, and no, I don't want to sit on the meditation, and no, I don't want to do this, and all the rest. And it's like, oh my, and very easily then I fall into that sort of I doing. Now I must make the bull do this. Now I must gentle the passions, and I must do this, and all this sort of thing, which is, the more I try, the more flawed I am by it. Because this power, this tremendous heart energy is always going to be stronger than I. You look at the picture of the bull and its herdsman. The bull, this, the herdsman, this. And it doesn't change. That's the way things are. But actually what we don't recognize is that the bull himself actually wants to come together with the herdsman. The bull himself knows that elemental energy actually belongs in a human form. But the bull is not going to hand himself over to some wet lettuce leaf. He wants to know that he can have faith in the herdsman. That because if I want to give myself into the passions, if the herdsman wants to give himself into the passions, then equally the passions are being asked to give themselves to the humanity, to the human side of it. It's a two-way thing. We don't always appreciate that. And so that faith has to live on both sides. So the bull continuously tests us by throwing up these things, that suddenly there we are getting along, following a timetable, and all of a sudden I don't want to get up anymore. I start skipping off a few meditations, and before I know it, the whole thing's fallen apart, and I just don't seem to be able to get myself back onto the cushion or whatever it is. And I come up with all my usual excuses, and then they all have to be seen through, and then even when I've seen through them, then there's just the emotional reaction now that says, I don't care, I don't want to do this, I don't have to. And that has to be worked through as well, because the bull wants to know it can trust the human side. And once that trust is there, then the two come together quite of themselves, because they have an affinity. There is no forcing with this. It just comes together. And this is, again, going back to that incident with the going to the gym and the cutting the meat. I do not know what happened. I cannot tell you why it all came to a head sitting on a bus. I didn't make that happen at all. There was a concatenation of circumstances. The outer and the inner just seemed to somehow come together, all in one go. There is this process going on, and we just have to live through it. And that's how it's. This is that script that Schopenhauer said. Who writes that script? I have no idea. We call it the Buddha nature, but it's a mystery, really, and it remains a mystery, but a wonderful mystery, too. When you cannot bring your heart to rest, that is called the tree of obscurity. Obscurity has no local abode. It has neither beginning nor end. And this is actually useful for us because I'm always interested in sort of going back and seeing where in the past something has come from. And it's not that there's nothing valuable to be gained in that. Actually, that's actually not the way that the Buddha's way works, at least not in the Zen school. What it takes is how we are now. It takes how we are now. And by saying obscurity has no local abode, it's rather like, for example, you know stories, those sort of fairy tales where somebody's under an enchantment and they're released by a kiss or something like that, or you have to do these sort of certain tasks, and then the enchantment's broken, and it all ends happily ever after. And usually the one that's been under the enchantment says, yes, a long time ago I was put under a curse, or I was put under a spell. And it never explains why the person had been put under a curse or why the person had been put under a spell. It's almost as if it's entirely irrelevant to the story. It is irrelevant to the story. What's important is that actually this series of events take place that actually leads to the end of that enchantment. And it's the same with this too. When he says obscurity has no local abode, it's saying it doesn't exist over there, whether that over there is in the past or over there geographically or something like that. I remember, and it's a useful thing to remember because we're always attaching our hearts to things, which is a very useful thing in one sense. Means we can do a lot, but in another sense we can be easily fooled by it. Again, I remember Venerable Nyoke saying that she knew somebody in the 50s who used to come to Christmas Humphreys' classes here at the Society, and he fell into a bit of a depression. And he said that when he had been a boy, the one thing he really loved doing was going to Battersea Park and going to the ice cream cellar and getting an ice cream and standing there and eating this ice cream. And he said he had the most wonderful childhood memories of doing that from time to time. And he fell into this sort of depression, so he thought, I'll cheer myself up. So he went to Battersea Park and, he bought an ice cream and he licked it. And he was still depressed. Obscurity has no local abode. Happiness has no local abode. He thought it existed in Battersea Park with an ice cream in his hand. Yeah, exactly. But unfortunately, decades had actually passed since that time. But a little bit we do that. Well, not a little bit, actually quite a lot we do that as well. We attach things to things, not recognizing. Again, this is what I mean when I say that Eckhart really already had quite a profound realization when he said, "My heart is not at rest." Please, heart. He knew that's where the problem was. That's where the solution was going to be, in his own heart. In his own heart. And that's an important realization, actually. If you cannot bring your heart to rest, you will climb up with obscurity, enter the 6 ways and 4 modes of birth, and wear horns and fur. And what this refers to, obviously the tree of obscurity just represents the delusion and the ignorance itself, but the 6 ways are the 6 realms that we find on that wheel of life there. And the 4 modes of birth traditionally are from the egg, from water, and from transformation, because it was believed that these are the 4 ways that things come into being. Obviously, the womb and the egg we self-evident. But from water, you have to remember that in a hot country, a pool of hot water that's there for any length of time very quickly ends up with little wriggling things in it, because fly larvae lay their eggs on it as well. And transformation, well, we've talked about the transformations. I mean, whether it's, for example, a caterpillar to a butterfly, something like that also, but also in us too. Things come into being due to transformations. Even our own inner attitude. An attitude can change, for example, and we undergo a transformation. We might witness something might happen to us. There was that, the Confucius example. He said, imagine, he said, 3 people see the same event. One is so traumatized by it, he never recovers. The other one thinks it's the funniest thing he has ever seen, and the third one walks right past it, barely even registering it. It's the same event. It's the heart that actually creates our experiences, which is what, like that, there was a poem that talked about the gardens of Nara in Japan. There are some gardens there that are a popular tourist resort. People go to them, particularly in them. And there are the woodlands, and there's sort of pools with koi carp in. Carp are very popular as part of these sort of places. And the verse goes that there's a clapping of hands. And at this sound of the clapping of hands, the koi carp come up to the surface of the water. The heron on the far side of the lake fly off, and the waitress, she brings tea to the guest. At the clapping of hands, the koi carp come up to the surface, the heron fly off, and the waitress brings tea to the guests. We do not know why the hands were clapped. It never tells us that. But the thing is that in Japan, the koi carp are trained to rise to the surface whenever they hear the clapping of hands. So they clap the hands, and then they put food on the water, so the koi carp come up. So now, after a few goes, you just clap your hands and the koi carp rise to the surface, and you can see them. So in the heart of the koi carp, they hear the clapping of hands, feeding time. But for the heron on the far side, it's a signal of alarm, so they get frightened and they fly. And presumably in the tea houses, if you sit down and there's no waitress, you clap your hands and your tea is brought to you. But the point of the verse is to show that at this single event, and as I say, we do not know why the hands were clapped anyway, and again, that's not important. The experience of that is created by the 3 hearts, the heart of the koi carp, the heart of the heron, and the heart of the waiting staff as well. And to the degree, actually, that is also true for us, that there are, 20 or something people sitting in this room, and we all think we're sitting in the same room, and we're not sitting in the same room at all. We're sitting in the 6 realms, and we're sitting in the 4 modes of birth. And this is what it's actually pointing to. But our world that we are experiencing is real in once, in as much that we really are experiencing it. But the problem is, and this is really what Master Rinzai is actually pointing to, is that those thoughts that come up, those thoughts that we experience them as real. And it very quickly, particularly if they get heated up, they become what's real for us. So I can walk in to the Buddhist Society, for example, I know Sarah, and I say, "Morning, Sarah," and she walks right past me. And I think, what's up with her? Now, and then I think, oh, is it something on?
You've lost weight.
And she's jealous. She doesn't like me because of that. She wants me to be fat. Well, who would have thought that? That's, here I've been making these efforts, and what, does she want me dead? What have I done to her to do that? I mean, I know the last time I saw her, I had to have a word with her about something because, it wasn't quite right. Don't tell me she's holding that against me. For goodness sake, and she calls herself a Buddhist. Right, I'm going to tell Gary immediately, and Venerable Myogun. She will be persona non grata, and Louise. Revoke her membership. Well, it's silly, but the point is, I mean, actually, those thoughts that come out, it's not just that they may be, but they, particularly when they become fired up, they become an absolute certainty, and they have that real strength of conviction in them too. And these are those 6 realms, because now here I am, a fighting demon. And of course we have those 6 realms there. We have the heavenly realms, starting at the top, the fighting demons going in a clockwise direction. We have the animal realms, the hell realms at the bottom. We have the hungry ghosts, and then we have the human realms. And actually, there's a nice little experiment that anyone can do with this, and it's quite a useful thing to actually draw your own wheel life. And just to take a sheet of paper and draw a pie chart on it, draw a circle and divide it into 6 equal sections and call them, heaven, fighting demons, animals, hell realms, hungry ghosts, and human realms. And just to quickly go around them to give a sort of flavour of what each realm entails, the heavenly realms. Don't think of the Christian heaven and hell when we're talking about this. This is Buddhist heaven and hell, which is very different. Heaven and hell in the Christian sense has a strong moral connotation. Actually, this doesn't. You would think that the good beings live in heaven and wicked beings live in. But actually, there's nothing moral about it at all. It just has to do with karma. So the beings in the heavenly realms, they are the divine beings. They're deities, certainly, but they have tremendous power, and they're often in a state of bliss because having a tremendous amount of power, they can have what they like. So they can suit themselves pretty much, that sense. And there's a sense of, obviously, superiority as well. And this is a state of heart that we ourselves can sort of feel it. Every so often we're feeling rather sort of full of the milk of human kindness, and I can dispense, even though she wants me fat. I forgive you, that's all right. You've had a hard day, I don't blame you for that. But on another day, if I happen to be in the hell realms, and I'm definitely feeling out of sorts, even when she said hello to me, well, that sounded sarcastic. That sort of every tiny little thing upsets me, depending on which realm we're in. So that heavenly realm is a realm of bliss, so power as well. And then we have the fighting demon realms. Interesting, the fighting demons do not take this term demon in the Christian sense. It's more in the Greek sense of an elemental force. So it's like a force of nature, like a volcano going off or a tornado, for example. Can be highly destructive, but if it's far enough away, it's just a force of nature. We may be awestruck and full of wonder by it. But if you happen to be living underneath it, then it's a fearsome deity. And so the fighting demons, actually, they're known as the semi-divine beings, because if anyone who's, presumably everybody here at one time or other, has had been in a huge, great rage about something. I don't believe you anyway, Susanna. Is there anybody here who's not ever been in a real fury about something? Then we know how divine that feels and how strong that feels as well. There's terrific strength in it, tremendous amount of power in it, but of course it's often very blind as well. So that's then below that, then we have the animal realms. Now the animal realms are very different. Animals are seen very differently in the East to in the West. In the West, we have a sort of dual, almost sense of opposites in our treatment of animals. Either we see them as, well, we use terms like he's a beast, or greedy as a pig, or something like that, in a very derogatory way. Animals are very below us, as we are human. And in the East, actually, the animal realm is seen as a very small realm, because animals have very little power. And that's what this realm really relates to. It's a sense of having no redress, of powerlessness. just having to take what's meted out to us. And if you think about it, it's actually quite an accurate description. If you're an animal in the wild, for example, even if you're a lion at the top of the food chain, if you bite onto a zebra bone and a splinter of bone goes in gum and it becomes infected and you get a huge great abscess, then you can't eat anything and you starve to death. There's no dentist you can go to. And if you're lucky, only if you're lucky, something might come along and put you out of your misery. So it looked at in that way, it's a very precarious way of being. And the animal realm very much has that. So it's just being in a situation or being in a mindset, certainly, where we just have to take what's meted out to us. And so it's one of the three miserable realms. Then we go to the realm at the bottom, and that's the hell realm, and that's really the realm of miseries. And in Buddhism, there's not just hell, there's 16, 8 hot and 8 cold. My favourite of the cold hells is the Atata hell, which is known as the teeth-chatteringly cold hell. Onomatopoeia, really, that's why. So, yes, you get the 8 hot and 8 cold hell. Well, we don't necessarily, you can look them up if you want to know what they are, but really it's just these different levels of unhappiness that we can fall into. And again, there is this deep sense of having no redress. And then there's the hungry ghosts. This is the realm of wanting. And the hungry ghosts are pictured, if you have a look, they have these huge swollen bellies, famine bellies that are empty, and necks like thin pipettes, so that even though they're surrounded by food, they cannot swallow anything. So their hunger is continuously frustrated. They cannot themselves at all. And so there is this sense of real ravenousness about them. And then we have the human realm, and again, humans, rather like animals, are seen differently in West to East. In the West, we tend to see human beings as flawed. To err is human, and he's only human, and all that sort of way. In other words, doesn't quite come up to it. But in the East, actually, to be human is something we aspire towards. A lot of the times, we live in one of the other 5 realms, but occasionally we live in the human realm. And perhaps the best way to get the idea of what the human realm entails in the East is to imagine, just think for a moment about who your heroes or heroines are, and think about the qualities that allows them to be heroes and heroines. Because somebody who's considered heroic will have a certain trait. It might be bravery, it might be consistency, it might be an ability to face obstacles and to see them down. I mean, even a sports person or a pop star, something like that. Somebody who's excelled in their field or been successful, for example. These are the qualities themselves we see somehow as virtuous. That's why we make heroes and heroines of them. But the Buddha, for example, would be considered an heroic figure. Somebody who has attained great wisdom and a deep sense of compassion, because we revere wisdom and compassion. So if we look at those people who we consider heroic, then we can see that actually they embody certain traits, certain qualities that we look up to. And so the human realm, if you like, is made up of those qualities. It's the best of being. So those are the 6 realms, and we can be born into any of them, and we are born into them all. And a nice little experiment to do, as I've said, is to just take a wheel of life, make it into those 6 realms, and just throughout the day, every so often, just ask yourself, what realm am I in? What realm am I a fighting demon? Am I a hungry ghost? Am I an animal? Am I a human being? And don't worry too much about the exact definitions. Actually, as you begin to work with it, you'll begin to clarify those definitions. And don't be worried about playing with it a little bit. But what the exercise really does is that it begins to help us become a little bit more aware of what shape our heart is in. Rather than just living out of the heart as it is, blindly, we begin to reflect a little bit more and see just what shape our heart is in. throughout the days, throughout the weeks. And over a period of time, you can begin to see which realms we tend to be in more than others, for example, and how that might change and why that may be as well. So all sorts of fascinating little nuggets can really come out of that exercise. Again, it's not about stopping the heart. It's not about saying, I shouldn't be a fighting demon. Obviously, we have precepts, we have our good behaviour, that's our outer form, but inwardly, our heart is still being born into these various realms, and to be aware of that. If you can put your heart to rest, this is the realm of the pure body. And the story of Eka goes that when Bodhidharma, when he said, my heart is not at rest, please pacify my heart, Bodhidharma said to him, show me this heart, and I will put it to rest for you. And although it doesn't say so, we can presume that that Eka actually went away and looked for this heart that was not at rest, to try and bring it to Dharma. And the story goes that he had a profound realization, and then he came to Bodhidharma and said, I have looked for that heart and cannot find it. And Bodhidharma replied saying, there, your heart is now at rest. I have looked for that heart and can't find it. What does that mean? Well, rather in the same way, actually, why is that heart not at rest? Because there is this tug, and brings us right the way back now to the Four Noble Truths, when the Buddha said, actually, it's being in that constant state of craving. This is why our heart is not at rest. I want something, and either I get it or I don't get it. If I get it, I'm happy for a while, and then it fades, and then I want something else. Or I don't get it, and then what? Well, I break my heart and I cry a little bit, I get over it, and then I want something else. So actually the upshot is exactly the same, whether we get it or we don't get it. So why then stake all of my life onto it? And the Buddha said, when we recognize that actually this restlessness actually comes from the heart, that it wants, and then wants something else, and then wants something else. This is the restlessness that the heart has. Now, where does that restlessness come from? That restlessness comes, the desires arise, because somewhere, at some level, I feel that something is missing. If there was no sense that something was missing, where would the desire come from? It is always about getting something, incorporating something, becoming something that I am not now. And if I want to, rather like that ideal image, I saw myself as lacking something. That ideal contained fulfillment. If only I can get that, I will be fulfilled. All desires have that within them. They're all there. Of course, when I get the object, the problem is it doesn't satisfy. The fulfillment then gets projected out onto something else, and then I desire that. And so we go on in this continuous chain. And this is why Master Rinzai used to ask his monks, he used to say, what at this moment is lacking? Of course, I will come out with a long list of saying, well, I could do with a new car and a better salary and a, better summer and all this sort of thing and a nicer house or whatever. But actually, what at this moment is lacking? When we look and see that it's our own heart that's creating all that because it perceives a lack. Now, in some cases, there might be a lack. If we haven't eaten for a long time, and it's coming up to lunchtime, then naturally we feel hungry. And if we haven't drunk anything, then naturally we feel a lack and we're thirsty, and so we want to have water, and that's quite correct. But quite often there are many things that we perceive as lacking that actually are just manufactured from my own imagination, for example, such as seeing that Steve has a much better car than me. I haven't got a car at all. Don't you roll your eyes that your car's a lot better than mine, because I haven't got anything at all. And I don't like that, and I envy him now. Now there is that lack. But actually, do I have to have it? Do I now move heaven and earth in order to get it? I may not need to move heaven and earth. But actually we really can run ourselves ragged on this. And it's those moments when suddenly that falls down, rather as it did on that bus for me, in that particular incident, that suddenly when we see the emptiness of that. If not one thought arises, you will at once climb up the Bodhi Tree, have the supernatural powers to transform yourselves at will in the three worlds. The three worlds are the realm of desire, form and no form. It's just another way of talking about the six realms. Have the joy of the Dharma and the bliss of Zen. The radiance of the essence shines of itself. And it's this essence, of course, is the Buddha nature. And this is what we give ourselves to, because actually this Buddha nature is manifesting in this place now. And this is what Master Rinzai pointed to. And the Buddha pointed to with the Four Noble Truths when he said, what at this moment is left, to really look. Because when we give ourselves into this moment, suddenly we find that it is full already. And that the perceived lack was actually only an appearance. And it was a mistaken one at that. And it can be laid down. And in the end, of course, everything has to be laid down. That is why those meditations on death are not morbid at all. That's why they're so important, because that realization that actually everything is not only empty, which doesn't mean that there's an absence, actually it's full. Because emptiness means the complete interconnectedness, the complete oneness of all things at all times. Not just as an intellectual idea, but actually something that is recognized and realized in one's own body. And when that is realized, then the transformations, whether one is a great teacher, or whether one is a monk, or whether one is just a nobody, whether one's on the mountain peak, or one is in the marketplace, whether one eats fine food, or whether one eats gruel, 100,000 flavors, different kinds of gauze and brocade, etc. All these things can be lived fully, just as they are. Because actually it's the partaking that's important. And again, I remember Venerable Myokyoni saying that the real difference between the heart and the head, if you like, the head was conceiving of ideas, something in the future that it wants to attain, wants to get to. Actually, she said, what the heart's not interested in understanding or attaining or anything. What the heart wants to do is to partake. It wants to just take part in life. And that can only be done now, because life is happening now, not in the future. And to waste our time on the future is very sad, because it means that somehow we feel things lacking now. But if we really give ourselves into this moment now, then suddenly we find that fulfillment is there and the heart is at peace. Okay, we'll leave it there, and sorry for overrunning.